In the early hours of December 8th, 1941, 10 men came ashore on Guam. Their orders were clear: to warn the people of Japan's imminent invasion, to sever U.S. Navy communications, and to scout the island before the attack began. Yet these weren't Japanese soldiers, but rather CHamorus from Saipan, Pulan, and today we're exploring one of the most complicated and painful episodes in our history. The story of CHamorus from the Northern Marianas, from Saipan and Rota, who served the Japanese during their occupation of Guam in World War II. For many on Guam, these men were remembered for their violence and intimidation, the one who beat up a lot of people. In the Northern Marianas, however, they were remembered less for their violence and more as people who had to cooperate under Japan. This story is one of colonialism, survival, abuse, and deep scars that remain between our islands to this day. The goal here is not to excuse, but to understand, to view the Northern Marianas CHamorus service to Japan as a window into the island's split colonial histories. Between December 1941 and July 1944, the Japanese recruited and transported approximately 55 men from Saipan and Rota to Guam. These men assisted in Japan's occupation by serving not only as interpreters between Japanese officials and Guam CHamorus, but also as enforcers, granted authority to use physical force when deemed necessary. This raises deeply emotional and complex questions. Why did these Northern Marianas CHamorus serve Japan against their own brothers and sisters on Guam? And why did some of them seemingly go beyond their required compliance, abusing or harshly mistreating Guam CHamorus? The answers defy simplicity. On one level, their actions cannot be understood purely as betrayal or collaboration. Yet from another perspective, that is precisely how they were experienced by many CHamorus on Guam. To make sense of this tension, we must examine the historical and colonial contexts that shaped their choices and blurred the lines between survival, duty, and complicity. The Marianas were formally colonized and politically unified under Spain in the 17th century. However, following the Spanish-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1898, the islands were divided. Guam was ceded to the United States, while the Northern Marianas were sold to Germany and later transferred to Japan after World War I under a League of Nations mandate. From that point onward, Guam and the Northern Marianas followed separate colonial trajectories. Two halves of one people, shaped by different colonial powers. That meant CHamorus on Guam grew up under American rule, while CHamorus in the Northern Marianas grew up under Japanese rule. Both America and Japan shared the goal of making the indigenous inhabitants of their respective islands loyal subjects to their regime. For CHamorus in the Northern Marianas, they went through Japanese schools, joined Japanese patriotic youth organizations like the Seinendan, and were socialized into Japanese systems of police, labor, and authority. As early as 1915, CHamorus began working as patrolmen for the Japanese on Saipan. CHamorus were socialized to attend Shinto shrines, pray for Japan's success in its expansion across the Asia-Pacific, and sing songs in honor of the emperor. Despite the racial hierarchies and discrimination inherent in the Japanese administration, life under Japan was nostalgically remembered by many as relatively stable and even prosperous. Lucia Dueñas recalled, "The living condition was very good during the Japanese administration. The groceries were cheap, the people were well off because there were lots of respect amongst the people. There was respect between the Japanese and CHamorus, and everyone was in good terms." Some CHamorus were apparently loyal and wanted to serve Japan. This is evidenced in a 1938 petition to become soldiers of Japan led by Jose Pangilinan and signed by 180 CHamorus. In the petition, they articulated how they enjoyed the civilization brought by the Japanese and were extremely grateful of Japanese rule and wished to be Japanese nationals forever. Therefore, they asked permission to become soldiers of the Empire of Japan. By the time the Pacific War between Japan and America began in 1941, an entire generation of Northern Marianas CHamorus had come of age under Japanese rule. They spoke Japanese fluently, respected Japanese authority, and saw Japan as their government. When Japan needed men who could serve as interpreters on Guam, they recruited from this pool of mostly young men in their early 20s. Many of these men were administrators, teachers, patrolmen, or had attended the Japanese Hokukatai military academy on Saipan. They were taught to see America as an imperial aggressor, opposing Japan's liberation of Asia. These were the trusted few, trained in Japanese discipline and ideology, now sent to Guam. In essence, Northern Marianas CHamorus service cannot be understood apart from this colonial divide. In general, CHamorus in the Northern Marianas were raised to be loyal, admire, and serve Japan, while CHamorus on Guam were raised to be loyal, admire, and serve America. Each group's loyalty reflected the colonial power that ruled them. So when war came, those two roads collided. As interpreter Antonio de Leon Guerrero explained, the islanders on Guam resented the Tsamoru like me who had come from Saipan. We had been given Japanese education and then been drafted by the Japanese, right? So even though we were the same Tsamoru people, we were enemies since we had come at the orders of the Japanese. This is why it's difficult to frame the Northern Marianas CHamorus as simply traders or collaborators. Unlike the CHamorus on Guam, they were never under American rule to begin with. The Northern Marianas CHamorus were cooperating with their own colonial authority, Japan, just as Guam CHamorus were cooperating with theirs, the United States. Yet the question of betrayal depends on how we define it. From a strict political standpoint, they were not traitors or collaborators, since they did not owe allegiance to the same colonial government. The Northern Marianas was never under American rule to begin with, but when viewed through kinship, emotion, and actions, through the lens of Tsamoru identity and the treatment of their Guam relatives, many on Guam understandably felt betrayed. Every interpreter who came to Guam had family here, and many visited their relatives throughout the occupation, blurring the line between occupier and kin. For Guam CHamorus, being mistreated by someone who shared their blood, language, and lineage made the pain of occupation even more hurtful. There was also the element of coercion. That Samoa's service to Japan wasn't entirely voluntary. For instance, Jose Villagomez stated, "We cannot refuse what was asked by the officials." Domingo S. Quintanilla expressed, "I didn't leave voluntarily. A Japanese policeman came over and notified me that I was going to leave." Henry S. Pegalinan recalled that he was not very much interested in going to war. There was a rumor that if you refused to go, the Japanese would kill your whole family. Under such threats, real or perceived, many felt compelled to obey. Yet testimonies such as these were made after the war, often during war crimes tribunals, when these men were being tried for war crimes and stood on the losing side of history. Who would ever admit to voluntarily serving the Japanese, especially before a military tribunal or decades later when such service had become a source of deep shame? While coercion was undoubtedly real and played a significant factor in why many interpreters served, though unwillingly, it is also likely that at least some did so willingly or out of a sense of duty, given the generation-long influence of Japanese colonialism and with it the normalization of patriotic loyalty in daily life. Further evidence of this mindset can be seen in the Tsamoru-led 1938 petition to become soldiers of Japan, and during the occupation itself, when some Northern Marianas Tsamorus reportedly debated with or even boasted to Guam Tsamorus about Japan's virtues and supposed superiority over America. We should be careful. not to accept grand narratives that oversimplify Chamorro's service to Japan as either wholly voluntary or entirely forced. Instead, their participation reflected a spectrum of motivations, ranging from coercion and social pressure to personal conviction, duty, pragmatism, and the complex realities of life under colonial rule. The very first wave of Northern Marianas Chamorros to serve on Guam were of 10 young Chamorro men from Saipan in their early 20s. They had been members of the Senendan, or Young Men's Association, in Saipan. 2 weeks before the invasion, on November 27, 1941, they each received a small note that read, Saipan Government Office, Head of Department Police Affairs, Nishi Gunzo. They reported to him. The Chamorro men met again on December 6, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were given orders to warn the Chamorros, cut U.S. Navy telephone lines, and act as scouts ahead of Japan's invasion. On December 8, 1941, these men landed on Guam, with 5 men landing in Letexan and 5 in Inalahan. The group in Letexan were actually captured by the Americans, correctly suspecting them as infiltrators, and were imprisoned. However, once Guam fell to Japan, the men were released. In total, there were 7 waves of Chamorros who came to Guam. While all of them served as interpreters, their roles were numerous. Their official titles were vague, from staff assistants, police investigators, interpreters. But in practice, they worked everywhere: in civil administration, Minseibu, helping with record keeping and communications; schools, helping implement Japanese education policies; military and medical units, translating orders and instructions; agriculture and labor, escorting workers and enforcing quotas by force if necessary; and what is infamously remembered the most, as parts of the police forces. Village substations across Guam were staffed by interpreters. Interpreters were part of the campaign to eliminate American influence and promote the Japanization of Guam, everything from discouraging English to enforcing patriotic rituals. They arrested Chamorros accused of hiding radios, helping the American stragglers, or showing disloyalty. Some interpreters participated directly in investigations and punishment, applying techniques they learned from Japanese police. A few interpreters were attached directly to the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, notorious across Asia for brutality. At least 4 Chamorros from Saipan, Antonio R. Camacho, Felipe C. Mendiola, Francisco T. Palacios, and Henry C. Pangilinan, worked under the Kempeitai. Wherever the interpreters worked at, the interpreters enjoyed a relatively high amount of mobility and authority. During the occupation on Guam, some embraced it, seeing themselves as essential figures, and enjoyed the power it gave. While certainly they remained subordinate in Japan's racial hierarchy, they were able to act essentially without impunity towards Guam Chamorros, and sometimes they would exercise this power in exploitative and cruel ways. This is where we get into the primary source of bitterness and feelings of betrayal by Guam Chamorros, not entirely by the fact that Northern Mariana Chamorros served the Japanese, but their actions of exploitation and abuse towards them. There are many recorded stories of abuse by interpreters during the Japanese occupation, marked by cruelty, humiliation, and systematic violence. The most notorious cases usually involve suspects accused of assisting American stragglers, engaging in pro-US activities, or even theft. A typical case began with the arrest of an accused, most often a man whose name, birth date, residence, and marital status were formally recorded. While the suspect was detained, officers examined the alleged crime scene, questioned witnesses, and cross-checked statements. Torture took place before, during, and after interrogation sessions. With no access to fair trials, suspects were beaten, slapped, and whipped, often tied under the sun for hours without food or water. Both Japanese and Chamorro interrogators used the tsilingwaka, a bullwhip, as their favored weapon. Prisoners were sometimes drugged to keep them quiet, preparing them for further punishment, and allowing officers and inmates to sleep in silence. Under such brutal conditions, confessions, true or false, were inevitable, often implicating family members, neighbors, or rivals. Torture thus extended beyond the body of the victim, radiating fear through entire families, villages, and communities. Interpreter Pedro S. Leon Guerrero was one of several men involved in these brutal interrogations. He is believed to have assaulted 11 individuals. One of his victims, Joaquin Limtiaco, was accused of hiding Americans. Leon Guerrero and 4 other police officials beat Limtiaco at least 3 times a week during his nearly 3-month imprisonment at the Higuchi jail. Another interpreter, Louis C. Crisostomo, assaulted at least 4 individuals suspected of possessing weapons. One victim, a woman named Catalina D. Cruz, was beaten repeatedly in Higuchi jail over a span of 5 weeks. In one instance, Crisostomo even beat her son until he fell unconscious. Not every case involves suspected espionage or aiding Americans. Some were punished for petty crimes. Interpreter Pedro Leon Guerrero, for example, beat 3 men for 2 hours. Their alleged offense was stealing a chicken. A particularly violent interpreter was Nicholas T. Sablan, described in a military report as notoriously cruel. As a police interpreter, Sablan assaulted several men, including women he attempted to sexually assault. In one case, he accused a man named Jose Salas of theft, tied him to a tree, and beat him until he confessed. The next day, Sablan tied Salas up again and beat him a second time. After the war, the supposed victim of the theft, Maria Brunton, testified that nothing had ever been stolen, but that she had been too afraid to speak out. Women were not spared. Dolores S. Cruz recounted how Sablan entered her home late at night, undressed, and ordered her to comply with his demands. She fled to her brother's house, but Sablan chased her down, catching her on the 2nd floor. He held me with his 2 hands and pulled me down to the floor, Cruz later testified. I ran away from him. When I did not want to comply with his wishes, he slapped me on the face and knocked me down the stairs. Her brother Juan, recognizing Sablan's authority, asked him not to harm her. Sablan replied mockingly, "I'll take care of her better than you can." He then took Cruz to the police station and later released her without charge. Abuse extended beyond the police sphere into labor and agriculture. Interpreter Nicholas Diaz, who supervised a work crew, humiliated and terrorized his workers. He forced them to serve him food and drink, and even to entertain him through music and dance. In one instance, he struck a man because he was late bringing tuba. He forced another worker to bathe him in a river. As Jesus Crisostomo recalled, if he said we were going to sing and no one wanted to sing, they had to sing anyway, because if we didn't sing, he was going to give us a slap to the face. We would have liked better the worst Japanese, the cruelest Japanese, than that Samoru from Saipan. Another interpreter, Jose C. Cabrera, beat workers for arriving late, fooling around too much, or even missing a loan payment. Interpreter Fritz A. Mendiola, believed to have assaulted at least 12 individuals, was described by one witness as laughing and mocking the workers he beat. He seemed to take pleasure in their suffering, taunting them as he struck. During one incident, he beat a worker named Jesus San Nicolas for failing to lift a heavy box and told Jesus that he couldn't do the work well because he's still waiting for the Americans. Some interpreters use their authority not only to enforce Japanese orders, but also to demean Guam CHamorus for their perceived loyalty to America. Throughout the Japanese occupation, at least 5 Guam CHamorus are known to have died from beatings and torture, either partially or entirely at the hands of interpreters. The names of these Guam CHamorus are Vicente S. Babauta, Pedro G. Sablan, Francisco C. Salas, Joaquin C. Mafnias, and Pedro G. Domino. Babauta, accused of assaulting his father, was taken into custody and beaten by interpreter Jose Villagomez and Juan Villagomez. He died shortly after his release. Pedro Sablan, accused of theft, also died from injuries sustained during his beating by Antonio Camacho at Juan Reyes. Francisco Salas, suspected of possessing dynamite, was tortured to death in police custody by interpreter Manuel B. Tudela. Joaquin Mafnias, suspected of possessing weapons, was tortured to death by interpreter Luis Crisostomo and a Japanese police officer named Takabana. Pedro Dumano died in an altercation with Crisostomo, which the interpreter claimed was self-defense. Relations between Guam CHamorus and the interpreters deteriorated so severely that even Japanese officials took notice. Kenichi Ogawa, former director of Guam's Minseibu General Affairs Department, later recalled, the Guam CHamorus did not like to enlist the interpretive service of the Saipanese CHamorus to communicate. They particularly resented the CHamorus civilian patrolmen. When a person told me that he/she had been struck by a Saipanese patrolman, all I could say was, you just have to bear with it. Yet this story is not one-dimensional. Under the strict oversight of Japanese administrators, Northern Marianas CHamorus had little choice but to enforce Japanese orders. How they implemented those orders varied from case to case, revealing degrees of cooperation, resistance, and moral struggle. Some interpreters quietly tried to help Guam CHamorus, warning them of upcoming raids, whispering bits of information, or showing mercy during interrogations. Guam CHamoru Maria S. Uggan recounted how one unnamed interpreter warned her group that the Japanese planned to execute them, urging them to flee into the jungle. Simona Garrido recalled how a Japanese taicho named Ibuka attempted to coerce her into spending the night with him. He threatened to cut my throat if I did not spend a night with him, she recounted. Simona managed to escape his advances with the help of Gloria, a female interpreter from Saipan. I was successful in evading him, she remembered, and was helped by Gloria, the Saipanese interpreter. Gloria's courage saved more than one life. She also protected John Pangilinan from the same taicho, Ibuka. When Ibuka made advances toward an 18-year-old woman, Dolores Ontalon, and learned she was John's sweetheart, he angrily summoned them both and forbade John from ever seeing her again. Sensing the danger, Gloria quietly urged John to agree to Ibuka's demand to save his life. He did, and soon after, John and Dolores secretly married, later raising 7 children. Reflecting on that day, John said of Gloria, "To me, I owe her. She's the one who saved my life." Agata Johnson remembered interpreter Henry S. Pangilinan assisting her family during the occupation. According to Johnson, Pangilinan had been friendly to the Johnson family, telling them of the times when the Japanese intended to raid the natives for American money or radios, or reporting news favorable to the Americans that he had heard over Japanese radios. Interestingly, Pangilinan was also accused of assault and found guilty in the post-war trials, illustrating the complexity and contradictions in individual behavior. By helping Guam CHamorus, interpreters risk severe punishment, potentially imprisonment, torture, or even execution, not only endangering their own lives, but also placing their families in jeopardy. Their acts of quiet resistance, however small, reveal the human capacity for empathy and courage even within the machinery of empire. Furthermore, not all interpreters participated in abuse. In fact, the majority did not. Antonio de Leon Guerrero, for example, was never accused of harming anyone and was known to let the workers he oversaw rest in turns. By July 1944, as American bombs destroyed Higuchi, many interpreters fled alongside Japanese officials. When they finally surrendered to U.S. forces, survivors from the Northern Marianas later recalled praying as they approached American lines, terrified that they would be executed on the spot. After Japan's defeat, the United States convened military tribunals on Guam to prosecute those accused of wartime atrocities. Of the roughly 55 Northern Marianas Chamorro interpreters who had served under the Japanese, 13 men, 11 from Saipan and 2 from Rota, faced war crimes charges. The defense presented a range of arguments: that the men were merely following orders, that they had been compelled by their superiors to use physical force, that they had been raised and socialized under the Japanese colonial system, that their participation in beatings had been minimal, that Guam Chamorros exaggerated the severity of their injuries, or in some cases, outright denial of wrongdoing. The tribunal rejected all of these defenses and found all 13 men guilty, some of assault and battery, others of first or second degree murder, and a few of both. Those convicted of assault and battery but not murder included Jose C. Cabrera, Pedro S. Leon Guerrero, Henry S. Pangilinan, Nicholas T. Sablan, Fritz A. Mendiola, Domingo S. Quintanilla, and Francisco P. Sablan. 6 others were convicted of first or second degree murder. 2 of them, Jose P. Villagomez and Juan Villagomez, received respectively sentences of 10 years hard labor and life imprisonment. 4 more, Antonio Camacho, Luis C. Crisostomo, Juan Reyes, and Manuel B. Tadilla, were condemned to death by hanging. In the following years, however, nearly all of these sentences were reduced, the death sentences commuted, the life sentences shortened, and by the 1950s, every convicted interpreter had returned home to the Northern Marianas. These 13 men do not represent all cases of abuse. Several other interpreters went missing, presumably killed during the American recapture of Guam. Among them, Juan Blas Castro, one of the highest-ranking interpreters, along with roughly 10 others. If they had survived, it is possible that some of them, too, might have been charged with war crimes for their actions during the occupation. Depending on how the numbers are calculated, between 20 and 45% of the Northern Marianas interpreters took part in abuses against Guam Chamorros, meaning that the majority did not. This aligns with what the records show. The most severe acts of violence, including every confirmed murder, were carried out by those interpreters who primarily served within the police forces, a group that likely represented only a small fraction of all interpreters on the island. In the decades following the war, bitterness lingered. Many Chamorros on Guam remember the Northern Marianas interpreters as the men who beat up a lot of people. When planes from Saipan arrived after the war, some Guam Chamorros were said to check the passengers to make sure none of the notorious interpreters had returned. Several interpreters chose to remain in self-exile in the Northern Marianas, carrying with them the stigma of their wartime service. Yet, not all were shunned or condemned. Some, like Jose Tenorio, rebuilt their lives after the war. He became a successful businessman, traveling between Guam and Saipan, and was later awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Guam. He was among the majority who had committed no wartime offenses. Even so, the surviving interpreters, both those found guilty and those never charged for war crimes, carried the burden of remorse. Many expressed shame for what had happened, haunted by memories of the occupation and by what they had become under empire. For example, Henry S. Pangilinan, one of the 13 interpreters convicted for war crimes, reflecting on his time as an interpreter on Guam, said, "I cannot remember everything from those days. The little things I can forget easily. However, those crimes against humanity, I can never forget. I am 80 years old now. I am subject to go any time. I am just glad that this is behind me." Today, the memory of the interpreters remains a sensitive subject, though not with the same intensity felt by the generation that lived through the war. As those who were alive during the war pass away, this history risks fading into obscurity, yet remembering it is essential. These interpreters cannot be dismissed simply as villains, nor can the pain they caused ever be forgotten. They were neither entirely forced nor entirely willing. Their story lives in the space between coercion and choice, where empire fractured identity, where survival blurred into complicity, and where colonialism turned Samoru against Samoru. To face this chapter of our history is not to excuse, but to understand, to see how power, war, and colonialism shaped our people, and to begin finding healing through that understanding. This was never a war of the Chamorro people's making. It was a war between two colonial powers, one that turned island against island, Tsetlu against Tsetlu, and left scars that only truth, remembrance, and understanding can heal. If you liked and enjoyed the video, consider supporting me on Patreon so I can continue to produce more Pacific Studies content. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on all notifications, follow me on social media at PulanSpeaks, and a special seduce Masi to Patreon supporters Puti'on, Dylan Sablan, Jesse Babauta, Athena-nike, Reyna, Taitingfong, Aguero, Kylon Eckert, Debina Cruz, Zachary Olivadese, and Jacob Allen. Seduce Masi for watching, Guahusi Pulan, and Pulan has spoken. Esta